The island of Sumatra, much like the rest of Indonesia, is the epicenter of a complicated web of rainforest deforestation drivers, many of them a product of a history of a system of failures. Whether it's transmigration efforts that started in the Dutch colonial era, the global market demand for cheap commodities, shadow corporations used by palm and oil and pulp and paper conglomerates, or stymied government regulation to curb the expansion of industrial-scale agribusiness and infrastructure, Sumatra in Indonesia continues to be a battleground of people and planet versus expansion and deforestation. While it can all seem overwhelming, measures can be taken to address the land use crisis and bring long overdue change. My name is Mike DiGirolamo, your host for Mongabay Explores, a special podcast series from Mongabay.com's global team, where I speak with experts from the field working to protect the critically threatened forests and animals of Sumatra. Join me bi-weekly as I dive into the unique beauty and key issues of this one-of-a-kind landscape and the people working to protect it. This week, I spoke with Nur, Yaya, Hidayati, and Philip Jacobson. Yaya is the National Executive Director of Walhi, the Indonesian Forum for the Environment, a part of the Friends of the Earth International Network and the largest and oldest environmental advocacy NGO in Indonesia. Philip is a contributing editor at Mongabay, who has been covering Indonesia for nearly 6 years. I spoke with Yaya and Philip about what drives deforestation in Sumatra and Indonesia, why it's so difficult to control, what exacerbates efforts to stop it, and what can be done globally and locally to slow or stop the expansion of continued land exploitation. While there are some signs of progress, there remains much work to be done, particularly on government corruption, corporate transparency, and alternatives to commodities that are increasingly in demand. But if the right measures are taken, such as new trade agreement measures, stricter local legislation, and a focus on eradicating government corruption, Sumatra and Indonesia can be protected from further harm.
I'm Philip Jacobson. I'm a contributing editor at Mongabay, focusing on Indonesia and the Asia Pacific. Sumatra has lost a lot of forest over the past several decades, largely as a result of industrial scale plantation expansion, but also due to other factors as well. Indonesia is the world's top producer of palm oil. The expansion of palm oil plantations in Sumatra has been a major driver of deforestation there. Certainly more so than in the Amazon region and the Congo Basin region, which, along with the Indonesia rainforests, are like the three biggest rainforest regions in the world.
Philip pointed out that the major commodity of palm oil is the primary source of deforestation in Sumatra, but that this differs from regions like the Amazon. So I asked Yaya if there was any other major differences in the drivers of deforestation between these other regions, and her answer was not really. The only real difference is the commodity.
No, I think it's not totally different, yeah. So the difference is only about the kind of commodity. Yeah, if you know, in Amazon, the driver is mostly from cattle and soya plantation, but they are basically opening up a large area of forest for market commodity. Of course, there's also different kind of forest. For example, in Indonesia, there's a lot of peatland in the forest area as well, peatland ecosystem, and probably not in Amazon. Yeah, but the driver is the same. It's the thirst of commodity to fulfill the global market for a cheap product to maintain this what's so-called global economy.
The global market demand is a problem in and of itself, but to better understand the effect this has had on Indonesia, it's necessary to know why Sumatra and Indonesia became synonymous with it in the first place. Initially, logging was the primary export under the Suharto regime in the latter half of the 20th century. This was stopped as the country pivoted towards plantations.
I mean, the palm oil industry in Indonesia has really exploded in the past 30 years. For a long time, Indonesia was a major exporter of raw logs. So they would just go into the forest, cut down the trees, and sell the logs. And they're very valuable. That was a big thing during the Suharto dictatorship, which lasted from the mid-1960s to 1999. Eventually, the logging got so out of control that they banned exports of raw logs and shifted to a plantation model, where instead of, cutting down the rainforest, the idea was to grow trees, which could then be cut down for wood, which could supply the pulp and paper industry and all kinds of other wood-based industries. So today, there's two major pulp and paper conglomerates, Asia Pulp and Paper and April, and they're each owned by these two billionaire Indonesian families. And those two companies they control huge swaths of land in Sumatra and in other parts of the country for tree plantations.
Philip and Yaya said there's a saying in the palm oil industry in Indonesia, and it goes like this: Sumatra is yesterday, Borneo is today, and Papua is tomorrow. Meaning that the expansion of agribusiness follows a trend that starts in Sumatra and makes its way eastward. But unlike the pulp and paper industry, palm oil specifically began in the Dutch colonial era through a practice that Philip described as transmigration, whereby laborers from the island of Java were sent into Sumatra to set up palm oil plantations.
Yeah, so if we look at this, the trend of forest loss, especially the natural forest, it's like going eastern. So if we look at Sumatra, because it dates back from the Dutch colonization era, where a lot of this commodity being traded is coming from Sumatra. So if we talk about palm oil, is actually dated back from that era. The development of palm oil plantation using labor from Java had been done since that era. And Sumatra is the first area to be open for this purpose.
And as Phil mentioned earlier, during the 30-year Indonesian President Suharto's regime, logging and wood was the primary commodity. But after there was a ban on logging, much of the land that was ordered to be replanted was then turned into plantations for both wood and palm oil.
And if we look at the type of activities, we can see in the early New Order during Suharto, it started with logging. Companies were given licenses to extract the timber and to be sold in the market. And the second cycle of destruction is for monoculture plantation. So the log-over area, it's very rarely to be replanted again. According to the law, they must doing the replanting. But many companies didn't do that, and instead they changed it into the monoculture plantation. So for pulpwood and also the palm oil.
It's important to note that at this time, Suharto, who was the second president of Indonesia and working off his predecessor, enacted a number of laws, namely forestry and foreign investment, that largely opened up land resources and incentivized development and undercut conservation.
If we talk about the forestry law, it's coming from the 1967. So the first forestry law. That's the time when the starting of the exploitation of Indonesian natural resources. So at that time, the government issued mining law, forestry law, and also the foreign investment law. So it's opening up the investment from outside the country to use the natural resources. So it's going eastern from Sumatra, and then it's going to the Kalimantan. So if you see the exploitation in Kalimantan or in Borneo, it's not the legacy from the colonization era. So it's a new one. So starting from the post-independence,
Suharto eventually fell in the late 1990s, and along with him came a decentralization of the government. A new forestry law was enacted, whereby rainforest that was cut down was supposed to be replanted. But among many laws and regulations, this went unfollowed, and permits to keep clearing forest for palm oil plantations were granted by corrupt politicians in Sumatra and elsewhere.
Suharto fell in 1997. He was the president of Indonesia for more than 30 years. And after Suharto fell, Indonesia enacted a massive decentralization of power from the center, from Jakarta to the regions. Part of that was to transfer the authority over licensing for plantations and mines from Jakarta to district chiefs all around the country. In the mid-2000s, early 2010s, there was an explosion of new licenses for palm oil plantations, pulp and paper plantations, coal mines across the country, but largely in Sumatra and also Borneo. So a lot of those licenses were issued corruptly. There have been cases that we've covered and that we've reported on or investigated where, for example, a district chief will set up a bunch of shell companies in the names of his family members and cronies, issue permits for plantations to those shell companies. The shell companies are sold with the permits attached to major plantation conglomerates. So it's kind of a way to launder the proceeds of corruption through what appears to be a legitimate transaction. There have been several cases. There was a district chief in Riau province in central Sumatra who was sent to prison for doing something like that, for issuing permits to companies set up by his family members, I believe. And then the companies were sold to the two major pulp and paper conglomerates, APP and April. And those companies are still operating. I mean, those shell companies with the permits, like those plantations exist. I mean, the companies were never prosecuted, but the politicians were prosecuted. And there were like several politicians in Riau that went to jail as part of this scheme. So certainly bringing corruption under control would be a major way to slow deforestation in Indonesia.
The effect of government corruption on Indonesia and Sumatra means that companies can use the land without truly bringing any economic development to the local communities it exploits.
So, as you know, Indonesia is also rampant for corruption. So, this is how the problem with the Indonesian forest, the bad practice by the company, the impunity, the lack of law enforcement, and also the corruption. This whole thing exacerbates the situation of the Indonesian forest. And it's going to Papua, where the last, if we can see, many forests are still intact, in Papua, and also some part of Borneo as well. Basically, right now, they are all under threat because of many development plans by the government, especially for infrastructure, for food estate, and for new capital and other project that is now being planned. Like, for example, the palm oil in the boundary of the country, Indonesia and Malaysia in Borneo. So this whole project in the name of development and economic growth basically will threaten the forest, and of course it will give impact to many problems, like disasters like flooding and also the landslide and also forest fires. And instead of creating welfare to the community, on the contrary, it's only creating poverty, because a lot of indigenous peoples, for example, they are being evicted from their lands because their ownership of the land and the forests are not acknowledged by the government, and a lot of conflict because of this. So that's the problem, and it's not exclusively happening in Sumatra, but also in other parts of the country, and especially the last remaining area that are not touched yet.
I asked Phil how these companies are supposed to give back to their communities, yet still find loopholes around doing so.
So the main ways that they're supposed to give back to the people of Indonesia are through taxes, tax revenues, and the creation of jobs for the local population. When we talk about palm oil plantations, there's also a requirement these days that the plantation companies are supposed to create smallholder community plantations for the local community, equivalent to 20% of their land concession area. So those are the ways that these industries are supposed to help the people of Indonesia. It's the stated justification for why politicians have handed, huge swaths of lands to these companies to manage. But in terms of taxes, I mean, There's a lot of reports that these companies aren't paying their taxes. I think just last week there was a report that, well, earlier this year there was a report by several Indonesian news outlets that April, which is one of the two giant pulp and paper conglomerates, was using transfer pricing to evade taxes from, I think, a pulp and paper mill in Sumatra. And they were said to have evaded something like $100 million in taxes. And that's not a unique story. That Indonesia's anti-corruption agency has said, has flagged huge tax avoidance in Indonesia's plantation sector. So there's certainly questions over how much benefit in terms of tax revenue the people of Indonesia are really getting from these operations.
As is the question with many big systemic problems, one wonders, why isn't anything being done about this? What stands in the way of companies being held to account to pay taxes and not illegally develop on land? The answer is multifaceted, and there are a few points to be made. First is that many of these governing bodies outside of the companies themselves are corrupt or have been corrupt. The current administration of Joko Widodo is attempting to make inroads in reviewing the issuances of palm oil licenses, but so far, nothing has come to pass.
Well, corruption is certainly a big problem in Indonesia. I think Indonesia is somewhere around the middle of Transparency International's rankings in the middle of their corruption perceptions index, which ranks countries in terms of how corrupt they're perceived to be. So it's certainly known as a country where corruption is a big problem. Yeah, so corruption's a big problem. The Forestry Ministry, which handles certain licenses that plantation companies need, is known to be especially corrupt. I think around 2012, before the current president took over, the Forestry Ministry was called the nation's most corrupt institution by the anti-corruption agency. So there's a lot of companies paying for the rights to develop land. There's been some scandals in Sumatra around that. The administration of President Joko Widodo is trying to clean up the palm oil sector. After Jokowi took office in 2014, he declared a moratorium on the issuance of new permits to set up palm oil plantations. And as part of that policy, he authorized a review of all of the existing palm oil plantation concessions in Indonesia. So the idea is they're supposed to review each concession and potentially revoke permits that were issued illegally or that have some other problems, like perhaps the failure to pay taxes or the failure to provide these smallholder plantations could be considered as part of that. There was a similar initiative in the mining sector under the previous president where they reviewed and revoked hundreds of mining permits that had been issued. There were overlapping concessions and there were other problems with these permits. So the current president is certainly trying to improve governance of the plantation sector, but I don't think any palm oil plantation permits have been revoked yet. It's not clear if any will be.
Adding fuel to the fire, many pulp and paper and palm oil companies, under pressure of NGO advocacy, have said they are committing to quote-unquote zero deforestation practices. Yet, like taxes, they find ways around complete transparency of where they are sourcing their materials and whether or not they are continuing to expand.
Well, really to understand this, you have to understand how the supply chain of one of these companies works, and really how the supply chain of these industries works. So if you look at the palm oil industry, you've got farms and plantations where oil palm trees are grown. They harvest the fruit, the palm fruit, and they process the fruit in mills. They crush the fruit into crude palm oil. And then they take the crude palm oil from the mills to a refinery and refine the crude palm oil into any of a number of more complex chemicals. And then these chemicals are used in all kinds of products, from cosmetics, snack foods, biofuels. There's a long, long list of products that palm oil is used in. There's only 6 major refiners of palm oil, and they control most of the market. Maybe around 10 years ago, as NGOs were campaigning, so these companies were all major drivers of deforestation. They're refiners, but they're vertically integrated. So they have their own plantations, their own mills, their own refineries, and they were clearing lots of forest land. So there was a lot of campaigns to get them to stop doing this. So as a result of some of these campaigns by groups like Greenpeace, started to see companies, major palm oil refiners and consumer goods companies that were buying their palm oil, like Unilever, committing to break the link between their supply chains and deforestation. So they're promising not only to stop deforesting themselves, but to stop buying palm oil for their refineries from mills that are buying palm fruit from plantations that are deforesting, right? Or to stop buying palm fruit for their mills from plantations that are deforested. They couldn't do this immediately because they didn't know exactly where all their raw materials were coming from. They needed to map their supply chains. So they committed to what's called full traceability of their supply chains. So they said, within X number of years, we're going to trace our entire supply chain. So we're going to know where every fresh fruit bunch that comes into our supply chain is coming from. This started around 10 years ago. To date, I don't think a single company has achieved full traceability. The big vertically integrated conglomerates, generally in their own plantations, they're not deforesting, at least as far as we can tell. But they can't show that they're not buying palm oil or palm fruit that's linked to deforestation because they haven't traced their supply chains. And they've made noises more recently that they think they can't achieve full traceability. They've some of them have said that it's not possible because of the way their supply chain is structured. There have been some efforts to use satellites to try to map out supply chains, but I don't think there's a single company, whether it's consumer goods company like Unilever, a major palm oil refiner, vertically integrated conglomerate like Wilmar, or, that's actually broken the link between its supply chain and deforestation. So in short, these industries are still driving the destruction of rainforests in places like Sumatra. And you get NGOs that put out reports tracing palm fruit from an illegal plantation in a place like Tesonilo National Park in Sumatra to a mill belonging to one of the big palm oil conglomerates. So they continue to get caught again and again by activists sourcing raw materials linked to deforestation.
Another way conglomerates circumvent transparency is through dark money schemes, dubbed shadow companies, where the true owner of a plantation or a company deforesting isn't certain, but could be owned by offshore companies set up specifically to conceal the identity of the true owner.
So there's a thing called shadow companies. So there's also a question of whether some of these conglomerates are still controlling plantation companies that are tearing down rainforests, but hiding their ownership of these companies in order to cheat on their commitments, essentially. And there have been some cases that have been exposed. There was a company, a pulp and paper plantation company called Muara Sungai Landak, and it turned out that the individuals who were listed as shareholders were employees for Asia Pulp and Paper, which is the world's biggest paper conglomerate. So APP denied that it was controlling this company. It said these employees had gone off on their own and set up this company and deforested without their knowledge. We did some further investigating, and it turned out there were several other individuals who were also linked to this Muara Sungai Landak, who were listed as shareholders and board members of this Muara Sungai Landak company, who were also linked to Asia Pulp and Paper. Well, no, then there was also a mill that was buying the timber from this company, a timber mill, that also seemed like it was connected to Asian Pulp and Paper because of the people who were listed as directors of the company. But the ownership went back to a offshore secrecy jurisdiction in Labuan, Malaysia, so you can't tell who owns the company. Offshore secrecy jurisdictions are a huge enabler of deforestation. What we think we might be seeing is some of these big conglomerates that have promised to stop deforesting are taking advantage of offshore secrecy jurisdictions to continue deforesting. Let's say I'm Asia Pulp and Paper. I'm the world's biggest paper conglomerate. I have a huge network of tree plantations, and I also have a network of giant mills that process the timber from my tree plantations into paper products, right? Not only that, I'm also buying timber from third-party suppliers, so plantation companies that I don't own, but I'm still buying their timber from my mills. I promised to stop deforesting, so none of my suppliers can deforest, none of my own plantations can deforest. All good, right? Except what we see happening is there's a plantation company that's deforesting. It's unclear who owns this company because it's an Indonesian company that's owned by a company in the British Virgin Islands. And you can't tell who owns companies in the British Virgin Islands. Or maybe it's owned in any of a number of other secrecy jurisdictions, like Labuan in Malaysia is a secrecy jurisdiction. Delaware is a secrecy jurisdiction. One hypothesis is that these conglomerates are controlling quote-unquote shadow companies and hiding their control of these companies through secrecy jurisdictions. or through other techniques like nominee shareholders, which is when, or like nominees, which is when, one guy's listed as the shareholder, but he's not really the owner of the company. It's just his name on the paper. So you don't know who really owns the company.
So what can be done about this? Philip elaborated something that is already being done, but it needs stricter enforcement, and that's through the implementation of a beneficial owner registry, which the Jokowi administration actually enacted.
Indonesia, a couple years ago, the Indonesian president issued a decree authorizing the creation of a beneficial ownership registry. So what that means is every company in Indonesia has to disclose to the government who its real owner is, or beneficial owner is the jargon, the true owner of the company. Last I checked, they were still struggling to actually compel the companies to disclose their beneficial owners. But that's what's needed. We need a beneficial ownership registry. And ideally, such a registry would be accessible to the public. So you or me or anyone could go on a website, type the name of a company and see who owns it. Instead, we're in a situation where, the biggest palm oil plantation project in Indonesia, which is in the middle of this ancient rainforest on the island of New Guinea, most of this project has yet to be developed. It's owned by, we don't know who owns it, because the owners of these companies that hold the permits to develop this rainforest, to tear down the rainforest, they're anonymously owned companies in Dubai. We don't know who's behind them. It could be the president of Indonesia who's behind them. I'm not suggesting that he's actually behind them. It could be the Queen of England or Donald Trump, or we don't know. It could be anyone. And this is, if they clear this rainforest, the carbon emissions are going to be equivalent to the annual carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels in Virginia.
Yaya agrees, but brings up a deeper point about sustainability practices. Since the way that lots of companies justify their exploitation is through the use of so-called sustainability practices, Yaya argues that if you only further expand and tear down more forest, that it defeats the purpose. She argues that plantations actually have the capability to increase their efficiency with the plots of land that they already have right now.
To some extent, there needs to be limits, to the product from palm oil base, because we cannot just change the whole Indonesia, for example, for palm oil. Right now, the latest data from the Ministry of Agriculture, palm oil plantation already covered about 16 million hectares in Indonesia. Palm oil woods even have a higher number. It's 22 million. It's what they say from their analysis. And compared to, for example, the food for land for food in Indonesia, it's only like 9 million. So we cannot just change everything that we have here to supply the global market. Of course, palm oil now considered as cheap because of many factors. Of course, they use fires, they use the cheapest methods to do the production, to open up forests, and also they don't currently use a good agriculture practice. So the productivity per hectares of palm oil in Indonesia is very low compared to, for example, Malaysia. Although compared to other commodity, the productivity of palm oil per hectares is considered lower. But then there is no serious attempt by the companies here in Indonesia and by the government to really increase the productivity of the plantation in Indonesia. Even a company person said that they can even double, actually, if they can implement the good practice of agriculture in their palm oil plantation. The tendency to expand more and more land and in the consequence destroying more and more forests is high, because basically palm oil is very useful to make a lot of things that we consume. But we need to really think about the limits for this, because we cannot just change the whole Indonesia forest for this. What the global audience can do to help protect the Indonesian forest. It's very important for the people, especially the ones living in the buyer's country, to understand the complexity of the situation in Indonesia, especially related with the natural resources management, like the forestry. A lot of problem cannot be solved only doing a kind of sustainability in a current definition, because we cannot just saying that this commodity is sustainable and at the same time allowing the sustainable practice being applied continuously without limits. There is a kind of assumption here, or there is a kind of tendency that as long as it is already categorized as sustainable, you can continuously consume this community limitless. To some extent, this needs to have limits because we cannot just turn or convert all the forests in Indonesia for palm oil, even though it's sustainable. We cannot just convert all the forests in Indonesia for pulp, for papers, even though it's the operation is sustainable. There needs to be limits that really give the equal portion for Indonesian people to not only depends on this commodity, but also to fulfill their essential needs like foods, like the water. Yeah, I think the thinking behind the sustainability, we need to really revisit it to this extent.
But what about disincentivizing the consumption of palm oil altogether? It's in a lot of products we use, but Yaya had a very clear answer on how this could be achieved, primarily in the way that foreign nations engage in trade deals. She stressed that it was possible for a country to stop sourcing or stop increasing how much palm oil it was taking from Indonesia, and instead putting more reliance on domestic vegetable products in lieu of palm oil.
People need also to look at alternatives, not only palm oil, for example. There are a lot of vegetable-based oil that also can be produced domestically, for example, in less carbon footprints as well, and probably more small scale. That also needs to be looked at, this alternative. Not only in the buyer's country, but also in Indonesia as well. Because actually from the natural resources that we have in Indonesia, there are a lot of economy that can be generated from different kind of products, not only palm oil and paper. Yeah, this needs to also be looked at. I think the global audience as well, people can also talk about this with their government. In trade ministers, for example, looking at trade agreement, whether this agreement or cooperation will create more demand for palm oil. It's not the sin of palm oil because they can be used for many things, but you cannot just depend everything on palm oil because it will drive more expansion at home in Indonesia. At least not increasing it. And trying to look at other, especially if we talk about climate change, that the less carbon footprints from the commodity needs to be put into consideration as well. And also, if we talk about the poverty alleviation, they needs to also consider the initiatives from the local community.
Yaya also cited some nations and examples of stricter government oversight to prevent the proliferation of shadow companies.
The US, for example, have more stringent regulation on this kind of corporation. I think this complexity of the shadow corporation operating in Indonesia needs also to be recognized and looked at. So when you talk about commodity, you also need to see not only from the natural sustainability aspect, but also from this financial aspect, whether it is illegal companies or, I think the cooperation with Interpol, for example, or the money laundering cooperation needs to also be established, because it's really create great loss for Indonesia as well. Not only their natural resources is lost, but also their potential financial benefit also lost.
Beyond cracking down on government corruption and market demand, there are the local communities in Sumatra and Indonesia to consider, and Yaya says that instead of corporate ownership of the land, that locals can generate plenty of economic growth themselves with small-scale farming and tourism.
Yeah, the main problem here, in my opinion, is not only about the kind of economy that will be generated from this forest. But the main problem is the acknowledgement of the government towards communities' rights. Because right now, actually, a lot of community living in the forest, like 40 millions actually, they live inside and around the forest area. And they can actually do a sustainable farming, for example. And of course, sustainable tourism as well. But as long as it is given to corporation, which is their sole aim is to generate profit, that's the danger. That's the tricky one about only depending on big corporations to do this kind of economic activity in the forest. If you look at, for example, area where the indigenous communities are living, there are still good condition of forest. Of course, it can, if they think it's a good for them and can give benefit for their community, they can do the tourism, But the main thing is that this kind of economy should come from the local aspiration. The main point is that it should come up from the community, so from the local initiative. That's what the government must do, and not just introduce something that are from outside that is not really the aspiration of the local community. This is the main solution for this. So a lot of example is there, but the problem is whether the government really want to look at this initiative from the community and really give room, at least the equal room, must be given as they give to the private sector or to the more exploitative sectors. But right now the condition is really asymmetrical. So they are, for example, government give facilitation to exploitation like in the level of 10, but for community initiative, which is conserving the forest and also generating local income for the economy, is given like in the level 1 or even 0, So this is the problem, the big problem. And I think if we want to relate this with the international and global market, they need to also understand this and also give room for local initiative as well to play part in conserving the forest and not just enjoying the cheap products coming from the destruction of Indonesian forests.
Yaya mentions that the Forest Ministry itself needs to reform proposed energy infrastructure projects, like a road which would run up and down the middle of Sumatra, opening up the area to not just infrastructure development, but also more plantations. In addition, another project she feels needs to be reconsidered is a confusingly justified centralized food estate, which supposedly is for COVID-19 relief, even though this project would take years to build.
Yeah, if you look at the infrastructure project in Sumatra, there is this ambition of the current government, to have connectivity from the north to south. So they want to make a toll road that really divides Sumatra from north to south. Also, this area will open up some forest area as well. That's the main infrastructure project that is now being proposed by the government. And also the energy project, like for example, coal. Although Indonesia already commit to reduce the emission, but in their planning for the next 10 years, they still depend on coal for energy. And Sumatra is also have big deposit of coal, And we can see, for example, roads being built that are crossing the conservation area. because to transport the coal from the mine to the power plant, and also hydropower project that are also being proposed, and food estate, another thing. So government is using COVID-19 as the reason to mitigate the crisis, the food crisis. And their strategy is to build centralized food estate. It's a large area to be planted with food commodity, but this will also create forest destruction because for this purpose, the government will also convert the forest area into non-forest area, meaning to deforest the area.
It does make one wonder if a centralized food estate is the best plan, or whether that makes sense given how COVID-19 can spread. Yaya doesn't feel so, for a host of reasons.
It doesn't make sense at all. Because when you talk about the more centralized food production area, it means you need to transport to many areas, and it, instead of limit the mobility, you even expand the mobility. That's first. The second is that food urgency for COVID-19 is an immediate needs. But if we talk about food estate, it takes probably years for these plants to grow and finally harvesting. So,
And if there wasn't enough to worry about already, Indonesia is also the home of quite possibly the world's largest expanse of peatlands, which is soil that is wet, and it's hard to build on, but extractive industries are now turning to it. The problem is that when these wetlands are dried out, they become a fire hazard, not only presenting a deforestation problem, but a huge source of carbon emissions.
Peat's really important. So peatland is a type of wetland. It's like decomposing soil that if it keeps decomposing for like millions more years, it might turn into coal. It's like compressed biological matter. Often like forests over like thousands, millions of years will like accumulate as peat. And peat is this carbon rich soil. And so Indonesia has more peat than any other country in the world. And Sumatra has more peat than any other island in Indonesia. And the conversion of peatland to plantations or the clearance of peatlands is a major source of Indonesia's greenhouse gas emissions. So peat's become very important to the palm oil industry. Peat's not ideal to set up plantations. If you're a palm oil company or a pulp and paper company, your first choice for a plantation is mineral soil. But as these industries have expanded across so much of Indonesia, there's not a lot of mineral soil that isn't claimed by local communities. So some time ago, these industries started turning toward peatlands because peatlands are swamplands. They're typically not occupied by people like mineral soil is. That doesn't mean they aren't important to indigenous communities for various reasons, but these companies started expanding onto peat. So what happens with peat is in order to plant oil palms or pulpwood trees, you need to drain the peat because the peat is this waterlogged, swampy soil. What they do is they dig these canals or these trenches, and they dig them over a huge landscape. And they're able to manage the water level, the water table in the peat through these networks of canals. And this allows them to open up new areas for plantations. The problem is when you drain the peat, it becomes dry and flammable. And when a fire starts, it can spread out of control and it becomes very hard to put out. Peat fires in Indonesia have become a huge, huge problem. They're a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. Indonesia is a top carbon emitter, and they're certainly not as industrialized as other top carbon emitters like the US and China. The biggest source of carbon emissions in Indonesia is basically land conversion for plantations, and a lot of that comes from peat.
While Sumatra, in Indonesia's case, is difficult to solve, there are some positive steps towards mitigating these deforestation drivers. Ultimately, both Philip and Yaya agree. More can and needs to be done.
There's certainly some ways that Jokowi's administration is an improvement over his predecessor. The moratorium on new palm oil plantation permits the beneficial ownership registry. He's also declared a moratorium on new peatland development. We'll see how this review that he's doing goes. And that's the thing I explained earlier. So there's a 3-year moratorium on new palm oil permits. And during that time, the government is supposed to be reviewing all the existing palm oil plantation concessions. And if there's irregularities with these concessions, if the permits were issued illegally, or if there's other problems, they may be able to revoke some of these concessions. So we'll see how that goes. I don't think they've revoked any concessions so far. Jacoby's predecessor undertook a similar initiative in the mining sector. They revoked hundreds of mining permits, but they haven't revoked a single palm oil plantation permit under this program. So we'll see what happens. There's a huge area of standing rainforest and peatland within existing plantation concessions that has yet to be destroyed, but a company has been given permission effectively to destroy it. So we'll see what happens with that. It's like millions of hectares of land, and the single biggest example is this project in Papua. I mean, I think if we want to get the environmental crisis under control, we need to rein in corporate secrecy and corruption, because, offshore anonymously owned companies are allowing bad actors to tear down rainforests in places like Sumatra with impunity.
I want to thank both Yaya and Philip for contributing to this episode of Mongabay Explores, and for their dedication towards reporting on the much-needed transparency surrounding the issues of deforestation in Sumatra and Indonesia as a whole. Mongabay Explores is an ongoing podcast series diving into environmental stories from around the globe. Be sure to check out the previous episode in the series, which covers the Sumatran rhino and all the attempts being made to save and conserve it. Watch for a new edition of Mongabay Explores every 2 weeks, in between episodes of our flagship podcast, the Mongabay Newscast. Special projects like this are made possible by our Patreon supporters. Download our new app for Apple and Android devices to gain fingertip access to all our new shows and all our previous episodes. We also ask that if you enjoyed this show, please tell a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. Mongabay is a non-profit news provider, so we rely on the generosity of our listeners, readers, and friends. To add your support, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more. Keep up with all of Mongabay's news from nature's frontline at mongabay.com, or get updates via Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, where our handle is @Mongabay. Thank you once again, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Mongabay Explores.